Hello, Steve. Hi, Kay. How are you tonight? I hope everybody is well. And I hope we get a few more people before I start, because I want to start with Stephanie Kelton's thread, and I have a feeling that will be of some interest to a number of our regulars. Okay, so let me start now, since I don't want to take too much time waiting. Here's the thread. Doesn't look like a Twitter thread because it's the unrolled thread from the Thread Reader app. So Stephanie lined up 10 tweets. She starts by saying, let's play the, quote, pay for game. Suppose you want to spend $3 to $10 trillion on a Build Back Better agenda. You've decided that you're going to play the, quote, pay for, unquote, game, which means you will show where every dollar you plan to spend is going to, quote, come from, unquote. Notice she puts pay for in scare quotes and come from in square quotes, because she knows that where every dollar comes from is congressional appropriations and Treasury spending those appropriations into the economy. And she also knows that when people think about showing where every dollar they plan to spend is going to come from, they think about how is the government going to tax us, or how much debt is the government going to float in order to spend. But she knows that. But she also knows, better than anybody else, how we really do pay for things. So then she quotes a tweet from the Senate Finance Committee and Senate Chair Ron Wyden. And there's a little video there. And the video shows that the IRS Commissioner Rettig just confirmed the annual tax gap is as high as $1 trillion. What's the tax gap? It's the gap between how much tax people really owed and how much they paid. So Commissioner Rettig was confirming that the IRS fails to collect up to $1 trillion per year. Over the last 10 years, that's $10 trillion. That's enough to pay for a whole $10 trillion Build Back Better plan without even raising tax rates at all, and without collecting any more taxes. And then she puts forth her second tweet and points out the whole point is to appear, quote, fiscally responsible, unquote. She puts that in scare quotes too, showing that you can carry out your spending without adding to the deficit, because she knows that what the people who say they're being fiscally responsible mean, okay, is exactly that they have to spend without actually adding to the deficit. In fact, they don't even know whether they mean the deficit or they mean the debt, because they tend to conflate the two. But in terms of the politics of it, they end up talking about the debt more than they do the deficit. They talk about how terrible it is that our grandchildren are going to go all this debt that is the results of the deficit that we are floating. Stephanie continues with that second tweet. In other words, for every dollar you want to spend into the economy, you have to plan to rip a dollar out of someone's hands. And the way she put that, the way she framed that, reflects her assumption that when Joe Biden talks about being fiscally responsible, he doesn't mean adding to the deficit. He means taxing the money away from people. Yes, ripping a dollar out of somebody's hands. Then in tweet number 3, she says, there are 10 tweets in this, by the way, the Biden administration has put forward their plan, which mostly relies on raising taxes on corporations. The president says it will raise more revenue over 15 years than he is proposing to spend over 8 years. And then she says, don't ask me why. I have to echo that. Don't ask me why either. Some of his advisors, his handlers, must have thought it would be cute to raise the revenue over 15 years. Now, I always thought that if you wanted to get a clean bill of health from CBO, you had to show that you would be deficit neutral by the time 10 years passed. But maybe they figured some gimmick that would give them 15 years. I don't know. I'm not sure where they got the 15 years from. It seems they might have pulled it out of you know where. But anyway, don't ask me where they pulled it from, because I don't know. I don't think Stephanie knows either. She says, don't ask me why. Tweet 4, along with some other changes, the Biden plan would take back the corporate income tax rate from 21%, I think she means take back up the corporate income tax rate from its current 21% to 28%, because Trump and the Republicans managed to get it down to 21%. I mean, that must be like a new record. Already, a number of Dems are balking at 28%. Hey, Joe Manchin. And chattering about going to 25% instead. And of course, CEOs are fighting back. Question, who are they fighting? Are they fighting Joe Manchin at 25% or Joe Biden at 28%? Or are they fighting to go even lower, to stay at the 21%? Well, we know they'll take whatever they can get. lower than the 28%. I mean, realistically, Biden could probably have Manchin over the White House and say, hey, why don't we split the difference at 26.5%? How about that? Notice, if the commissioner of the IRS is right, if he's right, and if they can go back and close the tax gap, then that difference between 21% and 26.5% is all gravy. It's all gravy because they would have already taken back a sufficient amount of money to fund the $10 trillion. So Steph says in tweet 5, if Dems don't have the votes to go to 28%, then what? Scale down the package? Fight over other ways to raise taxes? The opposition loves it because they know the odds of passing anything bold drop precipitously when Dems hold themselves hostage to the pay for, quote unquote, game. Yes, that is all correct. Tweet number 6. Is there a way out? Setting aside the MMT solution, which is to stop playing the quote, the conventional quote, pay for unquote game altogether, why not simply take the IRS commissioner at his word? Why not make the case that you can spend up to $10 trillion without raising a single tax? Why not? Seems like a great idea to me. A brilliant idea. If all you need is stepped up enforcement of existing tax laws, then you can play the pay for game even if you can't get the votes for a slew of tax increases. Maybe I'm wrong and the votes are there. Give it a shot. That was tweet number 7. So what would that mean? Well, what it would mean is that what Joe Biden might have to do is something like this. Put up his $10 trillion program. You know, the one that the progressives think he ought to have. Well, some of the progressives think he ought to have. Of course, Bernie Sanders thinks he ought to have $16 trillion. Okay. And I think maybe that might be enough. Anyway, it might be a good place to start. So they might, but for the sake of argument, let's talk about the $10 trillion. Let's say they put up the $10 trillion, okay, in this bill. And then they put up an extra $50 billion a year to give the IRS enough resources to go after all the tax evaders there are to close that $10 trillion gap. I'm just speculating it might cost $50 billion a year. It's cheap at the price. Hell, if you're closing a $1 trillion tax gap, if you spend $50 billion to close a $1 trillion tax gap, I mean, that's a 20-to-1 return on investment, isn't it? So you might as well go do it. So that means over 10 years, you need to have another half a $500 billion. So that's just in the noise. So your total spending bill then should be proposed at $10.5 trillion with $500 billion allocated to the IRS to go after all the scofflaws over 10 years under existing tax laws. Now, that would mean that no further tax bill was necessary. All you had to do was collect what they already owed you. So you could just do a spending bill. The spending bill pays for itself. You make that claim to the CBO, you say, the spending bill pays for itself. How does it pay for itself? Well, it pays for itself by completely closing that tax gap. Now we get to tweet number 8. Of course, I added something here to Stephanie's tweets. The idea that you could allocate $500 billion to the IRS over 10 years to go after all the scofflaws. They'd be hiding under every bush. They'd be hiding behind every tree. What would the people do who say, don't tax you, don't tax me, tax that guy over there under the tree? What would they do? Both strategies get you the revenue you think you need. And both reduce inequality, says Stephanie. So I guess I'm curious to know whether the administration is digging its heels in on the need to raise taxes, by which she means raise tax rates, or whether they would accept higher revenue to play the game. That was tweet number 8. And she says, as I've been saying for months, there's yet another way to play the pay-for game. Just make the case that the money you spend today will come back to you tomorrow, fiscal multiplier and all that. And she now has a little bit of fun. At the end of tweet number 9, she cites a post by Larry Summers in 2014. One of her favorite bad guys. She does a little tweaking of his nose there. Fiscal multiplier and all that. So yeah, but notice this. If you make the case that the money you spend today will come back to you tomorrow through the fiscal multiplier and all that, then you're sure to pay for the whole thing between closing the tax gap and paying for things through the fiscal multiplier. You're sure to close the whole gap. So that even more makes the case that you don't need any damn tax bill. You don't need any damn tax bill in order to justify this $10 trillion infrastructure bill. And so then Stephanie ends, and she says, with tweet number 10, she says, alternatively, we could all grow up and stop this nonsense. Admit that taxes don't, quote, pay for anything. That all government spending is paid for in one way and one way only. The Federal Reserve credits the appropriate bank accounts. And that's the end of the Twitter thread. And of course, she got in her last word, her continuing message: taxes don't pay for anything, and all government spending is paid for in one way only. The Federal Reserve credits the appropriate bank accounts. Now, I'd be remiss if I did not point out that the Federal Reserve credits the appropriate bank accounts on the orders of the Treasury Department. The Treasury Department orders the spending of the federal government for goods and services that create the net financial assets in the economy after taxes are accounted for. So, the Treasury Department basically says to the Federal Reserve, "You're my banking agent, pay this bill." And that's what happens. That's the way government spending occurs, through the Treasury and the Fed acting as the banking agent of the Treasury Department. Now, if I'm a fiscal responsibility hawk, and I'll put the scare quotes around fiscal responsibility myself, and also fiscal sustainability, if anyone wants to ask me about that. Okay, and what I'll say is, well, the Treasury can order the Federal Reserve to spend its congressional appropriation, and the Fed will take the orders and credit the appropriate bank accounts, as long as the Treasury has some money in the Treasury spending account. But what if the Treasury is almost out of money in the Treasury spending account? Then the Federal Reserve won't take the Treasury's orders, because as its banking agent, it cannot implement an order from the Treasury if there's not enough of a balance in the Treasury spending account. So the question the fiscal hawks should be asking is not how you're going to pay for this, because things are always paid for in the same way. But if I'm a fiscal hawk, then I believe that when it comes to the Treasury spending account, the real question is, how does the Treasury get the Fed to add reserves to the Treasury spending account? And if I'm a real fiscal hawk, then I think that happens through Treasury taxing and getting tax revenue, or selling securities and getting bond revenue, and that's the only way it happens. So I'm not really asking the question how you're going to pay for it. I'm really asking the question, how's Treasury going to get the additional reserves it's going to need to make the payments and implement its congressional appropriation? How much additional taxation is that going to take? How much additional deficit spending is it going to take? That's a more significant question. But the fiscal hawks don't ask that question. The only question they ask is, how are you going to pay for it? And Stephanie's easy and very correct answer is, there's one way only. The Federal Reserve credits the appropriate banking accounts, as is also reflected in this next slide, which some of you should have already seen. Most of you who are here tonight should have already seen. There we go. You remember this one. Congress appropriates how Treasury spending happens and creates net financial assets. Congress appropriates Treasury spending. The Federal Reserve creates the high-powered reserves needed for the Treasury spending account. Treasury spends the reserves into the private sector, creating financial asset contributions. So that's what we're talking about. Treasury spending the reserves into the private sector, creating financial asset contributions. The taxing drains things away later. And either it drains too much, so there's a surplus, okay, or it drains something less than was added to create a net financial asset contribution, which, according to the fiscal hawks, is also known as a deficit. But to us, of course, it's a financial asset contribution to people in the private sector. Every deficit is somebody's net financial asset contribution from the federal government to the well-being of that particular entity. So we got to keep that in mind, too. So, I already said that the fiscal hawks think that the only way to get the Fed to create the high-powered reserves needed for the Treasury spending account is to tax, either to tax or to borrow. That these are the only ways, or at least the primary ways, to do this. So for them, it always comes down to the question of, who are you going to tax? How much are you going to borrow? But of course, this viewpoint is seriously incomplete, because the Treasury can do other things to get the Federal Reserve to create the high-powered reserves needed to spend congressional appropriations. What else can the Treasury do? Well, I've said enough times, and I'm not going to go into it too deeply here, but what's not covered by Stephanie's thread, primarily because she didn't have to cover it in her thread, there was no particular reason to do so. There are more ways to do it. One way, of course, is to mint a platinum coin. And to create huge amounts of high-powered reserves needed for the Treasury spending account by minting a platinum coin, depositing it at the Federal Reserve, and having the Federal Reserve create the new reserves in the Mint's private enterprise fund account, public enterprise fund account, which the Treasury Department can sweep at any time for the coin seigniorage that is in that particular account. The coin seigniorage is the profit between the cost of the platinum coin and the face value of the platinum coin. If the platinum coin happens to be $100 trillion, the cost of minting that and getting it up to the Federal Reserve is probably $3,500. So the coin seigniorage is almost $100 trillion, which would be the amount of high-powered reserves that the Treasury would then get into its spending account. Gee, it can pay for an awful lot of appropriations with those reserves. and it can pay off an awful lot of public debt as it falls due. I just noticed the Peterson Foundation had something today, and they said that the debt subject to the limit, otherwise known as the public debt or the national debt, was now at $28.1 trillion or something like that. Well, that, my friends, is a lot smaller number than the $100 trillion. So that's one way to do it. There's another way to do it. That's called overt congressional financing. And overt congressional financing just means that in the reconciliation bill the Biden administration means to pass right now, all he's got to do is include 2 sentences, okay, a boilerplate, in which the Congress orders the Federal Reserve to create the $10 trillion in the Treasury spending account that would be needed. I guess I said it was going to be $10.5 trillion. So just give Congress orders, or give the Federal Reserve orders to create the $10.5 trillion that are needed in the Mint's Public Enterprise Fund account. And then the Treasury will be able to sweep the seigniorage. No, I guess in this case, the Mint isn't even needed because no coin is being used. So the Congress can just order the Fed to directly create the $10.5 trillion in reserves right in the Treasury spending account. It just can order the Federal Reserve to top up that account by $10.5 trillion. Now, all that money won't be able to be spent because it's only $1 trillion a year that is being appropriated for the program. So the Treasury will be only able to spend $1 trillion a year. But anyway, that's another way to give the Treasury the reserves it would need to spend the congressional appropriation of $1 trillion a year for 10 years. So I wanted to give you that little footnote to this very brilliant thread by Stephanie Kelton. Probably my favorite economist and yours. Okay, so where are we now? Still plenty of time. So, I am going to go to Jon Ossoff right now because Jon Ossoff did something neat and credit where credit is due. Jon Ossoff is due some credit. The credit was given to Jon Ossoff by Matt Stoller, who by pure coincidence used to be the office mate of Stephanie Kelton when she was the chief economist for Bernie when she first arrived in the Congress. If I'm not mistaken, she was sharing an office with Matt, who was working for Bernie at the same time. Matt is a very brilliant a young man who is now specializing in the monopoly area and the general area of the politics of monopoly power. and he's one of the leading lights, if not the very leading light in that area. There are three names I would mention in that area right now. Those are Matt Stoller, Zephyr Teachout, and also Dave Dayan has done some good work in this area. But Matt says, and he said this in his Substack on April 13th, which I'm now sharing, one of the thorniest policy problems to come before the Biden administration is over a new $2.6 billion Korean electric battery plant in Georgia. Well, it's a battery plant in Georgia, so how can it be Korean? Well, SK Innovations, a South Korean battery company, was both exporting batteries from Korea and building a domestic plant to produce batteries for automakers like Ford. Batteries are a critical input for electric cars, which is the centerpiece of the Biden green energy plan, as well as what everyone knows is the coming electrification of our infrastructure. Question: do the Republicans consider that part of infrastructure? They seem to be working on a very narrow definition these days. Trade law, however, doesn't let thieves export to the United States. And SK Innovations' rival, the older and more established LG Energy Solution, has accused SK Innovations of theft. The U.S. International Trade Commission agreed, noting SK Innovations had stolen intellectual property and destroyed documents. The commission ruled that SK Innovations couldn't sell batteries in the U.S. The president can overrule the ITC, but it's a dicey proposition to do so. I'm sure it is, because he won't even overrule the parliamentarian in the Senate, because it then means that other countries won't respect our trade claims when their national interests are involved. It was a really tough decision because batteries matter, and Georgia as a swing state matters. Moreover, this industry is one the Chinese government has explicitly sought to monopolize because it's an industry of the future. The Chinese government doesn't mess around when it comes to supply chains. The CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, sees control of critical industrial bottlenecks as a means to project geopolitical power, and nowhere is that more evident than in industries of the future. One of the results of the collapse of the free trade consensus is that policymakers have begun reshoring supply of such critical inputs. And this Korea-built Georgia factory was one of the higher profile attempts. Enter Senator Ossoff, John Ossoff, the youngest member of the Senate. There's no other way to say it, except that he just worked hard to mediate a settlement, facilitating SK Innovations paying LG a bunch of money, and then LG in turn allowing the plant construction to move forward. Ossoff flew to meet SK Innovations CEO, prodding him for more than 3 hours to strike a deal. Ossoff's staff stayed involved, coordinated with the administration, and Ossoff himself prodded when necessary. After the deal was reached, SK called out Ossoff specifically for his help. And Matt says that political leaders who actually try to wield power is a rarity in Washington, because doing so requires an unusual mix of talent, boldness, and ambition. Votes are just one, and not the most important aspect of wielding power. convening, cajoling, and working the levers of the bureaucracies to achieve something significant. By the way, Lyndon Johnson was a master at that, is often what matters. It's what John McCain used to do, which is one reason he was so respected. It's why Elizabeth Warren is feared, and why Mitch McConnell can run the Republican Party. I'm very happy to see that the youngest senator has an attention to bureaucratic details and a focus on what matters. And the results in this case speak for themselves. There's a picture of John Ossoff, who is a very handsome fellow indeed, who may have a very bright future, even extending beyond the Senate. So, I thought it was worthwhile to bring that to you if you hadn't seen it. It's really funny in some ways. There's an interesting comment thread here, okay, as well. But, okay, I do want to move on to Dave Dayen's column. So, let me share that with you. Joy Burgess Ramsey makes reference to Toto. I wonder what that comment is about, but I will look at the comments as soon as I get through the main part of my presentation. And this is from Dave Dayen on April 13th, 2021. It's entitled The Bumpy Picture of Post-Pandemic Economics. And Dave says, people are flocking to see a popcorn movie. Godzilla, didn't mean to mispronounce Godzilla, versus Kong, which is about, well, Godzilla fighting King Kong. It's up to 70 million in box office 2 weeks in its first 2 weeks, with better than expected numbers last weekend. It's another example that while the coronavirus still lingers, the crisis of not enough economic demand is fading away. I like to check these high-frequency indicators that Bill McBride posts weekly, and they're almost all in a straight line upward, with a couple exceptions. Subway traffic in New York City, where a new outbreak has raised caution, and gasoline usage, which recovered to about 90% of its pre-pandemic numbers by last June and has stayed there. Hotel occupancy is up. Flights are up. Movie-going is up. Some states have restaurant activity well above pre-pandemic levels. Business activity is rising at its fastest level since 2014. People are shopping again. There's an important perspective to keep in mind here. At the same time that this is happening, over the 12 weeks of the Biden presidency, something close to 9 million Americans had to file a first-time jobless claim. More than 4 million Americans have been out of work for more than 27 weeks. There are serious imbalances in the country, which made necessary the March rescue package. The fact that this money got spent so quickly could be an indicator of human need as much as pent-up demand. And by highlighting general economic trends, we risk neglecting the wildly divergent fortunes of rich and poor people within the country. All that said, the economy in aggregate is taking off. Goldman Sachs has predicted 8% growth in 2021, the biggest rate since 1951. By another measure, the boom will be unmatched since World War II. The consumer comes into the post-corona world with fat wallets and a need to get out of the house. There are reasons to be optimistic that it will continue, even if some of its technological triumphalism that may not work out. Good demographics, deployment of mRNA technology for other uses, the policy desire to keep things running hot, and savings on commute-related expenses strike me as positive trends. However, that last one can be just as negative as positive, or at least disruptive. There's increased well-being with telecommuting, but also less of a need for the stores serving the central business district, the ones doing dry cleaning and a quick salad lunch. As a result, physical retail businesses are going to continue to crumble. The UBS estimates the closure of 80,000 retail stores across the United States by 2026. I believe the UBS there is the Union Bank of Switzerland, if I'm not mistaken. And these establishments simply use more staff than an Amazon warehouse or a Dollar General. Even in leisure, it's too late to save some of those with weaker cash reserves. I was stunned to learn that ArcLight Cinemas in Los Angeles will be permanently closing, and I'd expect more local chains like this to go under. There's another problem, which is one of unmatched demand. Some demand can be accommodated with supply, like with airlines adding more flights. But supply chain issues have been prevalent throughout the pandemic, and added demand is snarling them even more. Let me try to explain this simply. Suppose you had two operations, one getting Manhattan clam chowder soup from New England to Manhattan, and the other getting New England clam chowder soup from Manhattan to New England. For the purposes of this example, there's one river between the two. A bowl of New England clam chowder gets across the river to Boston and is emptied, filled with Manhattan clam chowder, and sent back to New York City. And there are like 1,000 bowls doing this. Then the pandemic hits. Some shippers are just taking off with the soup bowls or idling them or sending them back empty. Over the course of months, instead of an equilibrium, you have 800 soup bowls on one side and 200 on the other. And now everyone wants soup again, and there's nothing to transport it in. Dave says, this is a real thing that's happening with shipping containers. There's a huge cargo backlog at the ports and container ships sitting in harbors waiting to be unloaded, and mismatches on cargo getting out of export-driven areas. A slightly different issue is responsible for a semiconductor shortage. Basically, producers fail to anticipate the demand that has stopped auto factory production cold. While President Biden held a summit on semiconductors yesterday, it's not like you can ramp up the chip machine tomorrow. And while we wait years for domestic supply, manufacturing will take a hit. For different reasons, mainly the noble goal of not allowing a flood of foreclosures, housing supply is incredibly low, cutting into an industry that usually rides economic waves. There are more realtors in the U.S. than houses for sale right now. This is how jobs might lag, or at least good paying jobs in an economic boom. Replacement jobs may not pay high wages or offer enough protections to inspire workers to take them. People don't want to be restaurant workers right now because they're hell on the unvaccinated. Women that cannot re-enter the workforce because of childcare responsibilities is another hindrance. Supply snarls are, in economic theory, at least going to lead to some random short-term spikes in inflation, which Stephanie has also told us about over the last week, helped along by a statistical anomaly. Year-over-year inflation numbers this spring compared to the very beginning of the pandemic when we had deflation will look artificially high. Indeed, the Consumer Price Index just posted the largest one-month gain since 2012. It will be a test of the intellectual honesty of Larry Summers, there he is again, to see if he points to these inflation numbers as proof that Biden's plan was excessive. That'll be interesting to see whether Larry has the intellectual honesty of Dave Dayen. These bumps will live along with a high spending, ready for action class of consumers who want to reverse their recent lifestyles. Jobs will come back, but people might be puzzled when they hit a wall. They might experience shortages they thought ended with COVID. They might have trouble with the transition to a new normal. Please, let's not have any toilet paper shortages. In an economy reliant on outdated habits, the Biden administration needs to understand these shifts and use fiscal power to fill in the gaps. In a way, this is a long version of why we need that infrastructure package. And I'd add, not just the $2.3 trillion one. We need at least that $10 trillion one. And if we do that well and people like it, we can come back later for the next 10 trillion, which we might very well need as well. So now on to Dean Baker's piece. Which is about patents and the pandemic, dated April 14th, appeared in Counterpunch. Patents and the pandemic, can we learn anything? We have to learn something. We haven't done that too well in recent years, have we? I realize that I may seem obsessed with the topic of patents and copyrights, but it really is a big deal. And few people seem to appreciate the issue in its larger economic context. I've written about the inefficiency and corruption associated with these monopolies for decades, but if there was ever a time when public attention should be focused on reforming the system, it is now. With the pandemic costing millions of lives around the world and costing our economies trillions in lost output, we really should be asking whether the current system serves us well in producing vaccines, tests, and treatments. Incredibly, public debate is so dominated by the pharmaceutical industry and its allies, we are primarily seeing celebration of the system's dubious claims to success, rather than discussions of the way in which the system was and is failing us in addressing the pandemic. We also should be discussing the lessons for possible alternatives. Indeed, we should. Starting with the failures, while we should all be glad that we now have several effective vaccines, which a large percentage of the U.S. population has now received, the fact is that only a small portion of the world's population has been vaccinated. In Latin America, less than 1% of the population has been vaccinated. And in sub-Saharan Africa, the figure is less than 1%. The enormous, yes, he said less than 1% in both places. There might be a typo there. The enormous gap in vaccination rates is important, not only because of the unfairness of the world's poor being left behind, but because of the risk the situation poses to the whole world. Yes, I was thinking about that actually earlier today. The risk is just incredible. If we don't get everybody vaccinated, or at least enough of the world so the virus dies out, this pandemic is never going to end, because the virus is just going to keep on spawning more and more mutants. And we will not be able to keep up with the mutants. I don't know if any of you had an occasion to see today that the B.1.1.7 variant of the virus makes our young people and our children more vulnerable than they were before. It more easily infects them. We want them to return to school. And the B.1.1.7 variant is becoming the dominant variant in the United States. Because even here, we are not vaccinating people fast enough to make COVID die out here. Now, if we do not get the people in South America vaccinated, in Africa vaccinated, and in other areas of the world, if they are not vaccinated, how many more mutants are we going to have on our hands? And how long will it be until a mutant escapes one of the current vaccines that have been produced? We'd be continuously producing new vaccines to cope with the mutants. We might get very, very good at that, and it might happen faster and faster and faster. But I don't know about you. I don't want to go have a vaccination every month, in order to get ahead of this thing. We have to act in a practical way now. Continuing with the article, however. The enormous gap in vaccination rates is important, not only because of the risk poses to the whole world. I read that. If the pandemic is allowed to spread unchecked through the developing world, it is certain we will see more. We will see more mutations. It is very possible that some of these mutations may be more contagious and or more deadly and more resistant to our current crop of vaccines. That is an understatement. The last possibility should make us very worried, says Dean Baker. The makers of the mRNA vaccines are confident they will be able to tweak their current vaccines to protect against new variants. That may prove to be true, but even if it is the case, we will still be looking at a disastrous scenario. In a best-case scenario, we would still be looking at many months where a new variant was spreading across the country while we wait for a new vaccine to be tested and then produced in mass quantities. We would then need to distribute and administer hundreds of millions of shots. In the meantime, we'd be looking at more sickness, death, and economic shutdowns. A disastrous scenario. Not the first disastrous scenario we have seen. Way back in March of 2020, or perhaps it was late in February, I forget the exact date of the article, but I distinctly remember somebody from Harvard Medical School outlining the scenario to be avoided in relation to the coronavirus, which turned out to be the exact scenario that occurred because of the incompetence, venality, and stupidity of the Trump administration. The exact scenario that was warned against came true because people would not go the New Zealand route here and essentially kill off the spread of the virus within a few weeks. It was just too much. We couldn't be bothered to do that. Well, here's another disastrous scenario. And it looks like we can't be bothered to guard against that either. Dean says, given the enormous costs associated with a vaccine-resistant strain, we should be doing everything possible to get the whole world vaccinated as quickly as possible. We clearly are not going this route, as the U.S. and other wealthy countries insist on maintaining patent protections, as well as doing nothing to ensure the technologies needed to manufacture vaccines are made widely available instead of being kept as industrial secrets. There have been numerous efforts to point to the mRNA vaccines developed by Pfizer and Moderna as great successes of our system of patent monopoly financing of drug research. These celebrations are bizarre because so much of the research that led up to these vaccines was done on the taxpayer's tab through funding by the National Institutes of Health and other government agencies. Earlier this month, the New York Times ran a piece on Catalin Carrico, one of the heroes in the development of the mRNA technology, who spent her career going from lab to lab, where she was supported by government grants. According to the piece, she never made more than $60,000 a year. This was the sort of work that created the basis for the developments of the vaccines shortly after the pandemic was recognized. The scientists at both Moderna and Pfizer, actually its German partner BioNTech, have boasted about how they were able to develop the vaccines now being distributed in a matter of days after getting the genome for the virus. These companies claim this success was only possible because of years of prior research. That claim is true, but most of the key research was done on the taxpayer's dime, not out of the pockets of these companies. Well, other than referring to the taxpayer's dime, okay, I'm all with that particular statement. In short, telling the story of the mRNA vaccines as a tale of a successful patent system is a serious rewrite of history. This is a story where two companies stand to make tens of billions in profits off of decades of publicly funded research while putting relatively little of their own money at risk. In fact, if there is a tale to be told about the development of vaccines in response to the pandemic, it is how public funding can provide an enormous push to medical progress. In addition to the years in which the NIH supported the development of mRNA technology, we had the one-time influx of $10 billion in public funding through Operation Warp Speed. While this is a substantial sum, it is just 11% of the $90 billion that the industry reports spending on research each year. This means that if we think that $1 of public funding is equal to $1 of private funding and its impact, then we should have expected OWS to have roughly 1/10 of the impact on medical progress as the industry's annual spending. From what we have seen to date, this public spending could quite possibly have an impact that is 10 times as large as the industry's $90 billion in spending. In addition to helping to quickly develop vaccines against the coronavirus, it looks as though it is also leading to spin-off results that could result in effective vaccines against malaria, AIDS, and possibly other diseases. And we must remember that only a portion of the $10 billion from OWS went to developing vaccines. Much of the funding went to developing treatments and tests. Even this picture understates the potential benefits from publicly funded research. There was little concern from the Trump administration about sharing findings. If publicly funded research was fully open source, researchers could build more quickly on each other's successes and failures. There would also be the benefit that the cost of research itself is inflated by patent monopolies due to the fact that many of the tools researchers must use are themselves protected by patents. As a result of patent protection, these tools sell at prices that are many 1,000% above the free market price. In addition to the likelihood that research would advance more quickly if it were fully open, we would also have the advantage that we would take away the perverse incentives created by the monopolies. When a drug or vaccines can sell for many 1,000% above the free market price due to a government granted monopoly, we give companies an enormous incentive to lie about the safety and effectiveness of their products. We saw this most dramatically with the opioid crisis. The leading manufacturers of the new generation of opioids paid billions in settlements based on the allegation that they deliberately misled doctors about the addictiveness of the new generation of opioids in order to maximize sales. They would have had little incentive to push their drugs so aggressively if they had been selling as cheap generics. We've seen the same sort of issue in the pandemic, where all the drug companies have been less fully transparent in sharing their clinical data. Most notably, AstraZeneca was accused of cherry-picking results to inflate the reported effectiveness of its vaccine. More recently, the company insisted there was no issue with its vaccines causing blood clots, even though a number of young, healthy people got the blood clots, many of them fatal, shortly after receiving its vaccine. If the people managing clinical trials and overseeing the vaccine's safety had no incentive to misrepresent evidence, then we should see many future cases of deliberate lying. Anyone who believes that people respond to incentives has to accept this fact. Patents and copyright monopolies are also a big part of the story of inequality. Bill Gates is the poster child on this one. He's one of the world's richest people because the government will arrest anyone who uses software developed by Microsoft without its permission. Without government-granted patent and copyright monopolies, Mr. Gates would probably still be working for a living. But we are also getting a lesson on the inequality story in front of our faces in the pandemic. The shareholders and top scientists at the top scientists at the Moderna and Pfizer companies and the other leading manufacturers stand to make billions that will come out of the pockets of the rest of us. The amount of money transferred to the drug industry alone through the patent the protections is close to $400 billion a year. This comes to more than $5,000 a year for a family of four. People would have a lot more money in their pockets if drugs sold for $10 or $20 a prescription instead of hundreds or thousands of dollars. When economists claim that technology is the cause of the growth in inequality over the last 4 decades, they actually mean that patent and copyright monopolies are the cause. These government granted monopolies are what allowed a relatively small group of people to get a grossly disproportionate share of the benefits of new technologies. It wasn't the fault of the software, or the mRNA. Finally, it is important that we recognize that the rents created by patent and copyrights are implicit forms of government debt. With the passage of President Biden's recovery plan and his newly proposed infrastructure package, we have seen the deficit hawks return in force, warning about the burden the debt will be placing on our children. Don't forget our grandchildren. They love to talk about our grandchildren. The argument is that they will have to pay higher taxes to service the debt created by current and future deficits. While I have mocked this argument numerous times, if anyone wants to take debt service burden seriously, they have to also include the higher prices our children will pay for drugs, for medical equipment, software, and other items due to the patent and copyright monopolies that we are currently granting. It makes zero sense to claim that a tax on these or other items to cover debt service is a burden, but paying higher prices due to patent or copyright monopoly is not. Unfortunately, no one expects the people who lead our policy debates to be consistent, so the debt whiners literally never have to comment on the burdens of patents and copyrights. Can we get to a patent-free world? To my view, there is no economic policy that is worse in its outcomes than our system of patents and copyright financing for prescription drugs. Yet the question of alternatives almost never comes up in policy discussions. He points out my scheme is in chapter 5, of Rigged. He gives a link to his book, to Rigged, and points out it's free. It's an ebook, and he distributed it at zero cost to you. All you have to do is go and download it and read chapter 5. It is encouraging that there are politically plausible proposals to limit drug prices in the United States comparable to the limits that already exist in Europe, Canada, and elsewhere. However, as we know, intellectuals have a hard time dealing with new ideas. Even though having public funding of biomedical research is not new, in public debates, it is treated like an alien concept. Corruption and inertia are very powerful forces in public policy. But we can still hope. This post originally appeared on Dean Baker's the Patreon site, and he has a link to his Patreon site in the article from Counterpunch. He is the senior economist and co-founder at the Center, I edited and co-founder at the Center for Economic and Policy Research in Washington, D.C. And he is one of the top economists in the United States, in my view, even though he is not, an MMTer. He's still very, very good and always worth actually reading. So, I will stop now, and I will turn to what I'm sure are your excellent comments. And so, Kay says, hi, Steve. Dolores says, hi, all. Gina Marie says, hi, friends. Hi, Gina Marie. Joy Burgess Ramsey says, hello, I'm tired. I'll just relax and listen. That's okay, Joy. Thank you for coming. And Kay says, I'm good. Watch Kelton, okay, in an episode of The Conversation. Very good. Yep, she's always very good. Steve Gonzo says, Killbox. Not sure what Killbox means. And Tony says, Joy, Dr. Firestone is the man you have to listen. Joy says, hello, Toto. We had a busy day. Deborah Wilson says, was thrilled to see Kelton on my Britain Canary on a conference today. But what is your Britain Canary, by the way, Deborah? Bonnie says, hi, everyone. Lana says, hi there. Kay says, the filthy rich need to pay. And Rahul Majumdar says, the wealthy should pay their share of federal taxes, but not to fund federal programs. Yes, indeed, Rahul, for the sake of democracy. Rahul says from Dr. Kelton's book, it's stabbed, not tabs. And I've forgotten what that stands for. The S stands for spend, and the T stands for tax. I'm no longer sure what the A and the B stand for. I'm sorry, Rahul. I have to go back and refresh my memory on that. The Fed is the banking agent of the Treasury Department. Absolutely the banking agent of the Treasury Department. Aaron says, Joe, you are very prolific. With respect to what, Aaron? And Steve says, Treasury Department sanctions Russia. Oh, God, them with Russia. Russia. Sanction this, sanction that. Sanction the other thing. Carmen says, just made it home. About to share an invite. Hi, Dr. J. Blessed be everyone. And suddenly my comment skipped almost all the way to the end. So I have to go. Here we go. I found it already. That was quick. And Rahul says, public debt equals net financial asset contribution. Well, actually, it's the accumulation of net financial asset contributions. And it equals that, but that it's not defined in that way. The public debt is defined. The public debt, subject to the limit, okay, is actually defined by the principal value of the unredeemed Treasury securities. That is the legal definition of the public debt. Kay says, Pegosi needs to go. Absolutely. Vacate the chair. She needs to go tomorrow. Vacate the chair. They need to make a vacate the chair motion. She is an albatross around the necks of the progressives. Rahul Majumdar says, Georgia is always in the news, not always for the best reasons. Kay says, China now owns the Smithfield meat plants too. Rahul says, small victory for Ossoff, still too neoliberal for my taste. Oh yeah, this was a neoliberal thing to do, certainly. I mean, it wasn't, I'm not saying it was especially neoliberal. It was neither neoliberal nor not neoliberal, but it was consistent with the neoliberal ideology. Yeah, I have no reason to believe that he's not neoliberal because he did this, but he still did something good. Kay says, Ossoff is a very brilliant guy. I have that impression that he's very bright. Kay says, markets were way up, but today, Rahul says the Evergreen ship blocked the Suez Canal, costing the global economy. Steve Gonzo says, Ohio anti-mask by restaurateur closes. No one wants to work there. He blames lazy people living off COVID benefits. Kay says, which one is that? Steve Gonzo. Rahul says, too much toilet paper and storage now. Laugh out loud. Well, toilet paper keeps in storage. Maybe prices will be going down at Costco. Steve says, sorry, can't find it right now. He's been in the news. Ralph says, must have global herd immunity. Local herd immunity is not enough, right? Not even national herd immunity is enough. Not even continental herd immunity is enough. We need worldwide herd immunity. Okay, says Ohio is a mess, Steve. Probably with his help. Franklin City is purple again. Steve says Dale's Diner in Waterville, Ohio. Carmen Muniz says 20,000 new cases in India in one day. 2 people in ICU beds. The virus isn't going anywhere. Republicans alone won't get vaccinated just to make the Biden's vaccine plan a failure. Well, I guess that's going to kill off 1 in the 150 Republicans who won't get vaccinated. I understand the chances are now 1 in 150 of having a fatality if you're just in the general population and you're not exposed to the vaccine. Kay says, I'm not anywhere close to there, but there are probably many more like him. And Joy says, is there no one that's honest enough to get the word out over free speech TV about the parents in our government again taking the side of wealthy corporations instead of people? Well, we're honest enough. Joy says, I mean patents. Yeah, taking the side of patents, yes. Not patents, Joy. Corporations, taking the side of corporations who do the patents. Raul says, Dr. Jonas Salk didn't patent the polio vaccine. No, he did not. No, he did not. Kay says, Hartman brings that up, Joy. Yes, Hartman does. Hartman reads Dean Baker, for sure. Antonio Calhouse says, oh, yes, Antonio gives us the link to the Counterpunch article, which, by the way, is also in my description. Antonio says, just like in the human genome, now the editing is private. And Rahul says, Dr. Banting also sold the insulin patent to the University of Toronto for $1 Canadian. Joy says, I haven't been seeing Hartman for 2 weeks. Too busy, Kay Clock Ride. Kay says, doctors used to work for humanity, not these days. Joy says, I missed something important. Oh, you did? Kay says, Hartman is the only one on there I watch anymore. Joy says, is it every country or just the U.S.? Is it every country that does what, Joy? If you're talking about that is giving the companies patent protection, well, there's the U.S. and there's also the U.K. And I guess also there are other countries, okay, in Europe that may be doing it. Okay, I'm not sure what China is doing. They supposedly have a vaccine out, but no one is sure, okay, of its effectiveness today. I was half joking with Bonnie today. I don't even know if it's even a half joke. It might be only 1/10 of a joke. That the country that will save the world is probably going to be Cuba, because Cuba's pretty close. Okay, it's got some vaccines in trial, and more than one. And when Cuba gets those vaccines out, it will share with every country in the world, including the United States, if we should ever want a Cuban vaccine. Antonio says, all street drugs are addictive and induce psychotic behavior. Who do we sue when our children end up in jail for none of their fault but wanting to try something? That something ought to be college, not drugs. Kay says, Professor Wolf brought that up today too, I think, okay, on Hartman. Joyce says, I bought his latest book, Wolf. Antonio says, just got here myself. Kay says, I love Wolf, been following him for years. He had, by the way, very good comments today on by U.S. Foreign policy. But very, very good comments. I forget who he was on with. Okay. I don't think it was Tom. I'm trying to think of who he was on with today, but he was really quite excellent. I was well impressed with his account. I think in part he was talking about trade, but oh yes, it was in the context of how we're trying to handle Russia, okay, and China, and how silly it all is, what bad policy, okay, it all is, and he was doing great. Antonio says Dean Baker is the senior economist at the Center for Economic Policy Research in Washington, D.C., yes. And Rahul says tax and borrow. And Joyce says, good night, I learned a lot. Thank you for caring. I can't see the bad guys changing till all the people know the truth. Well, maybe not, Joy, but we got to try our best to get the bad guys to change. And Kay says, night, Joy. Lana says, I have just been listening too. Anthony says, I just got here. Thanks. Thank you all for joining. If you want to go fast, you go alone. If you want to go fast, you bring your friends. And Lana says, and borrow. Joy, this is the upper class exquisite syllabus. Lana says, hashtag vacate the chair. Antonio says, many vaccination programs suspended. But Lana asks, I should ask, who wanted the Medicare for All bill to go through 6 committees? It was assigned to 7 committees. But Pelosi or Jayapal? But do you think this is a good thing? I think Jayapal probably would have been satisfied if it just went through the Jim McGovern's committee and the Energy and Resource Committee, but basically Palone's committee. Okay, I think she would have been happy with that. But you know, everything has to go through Ways and Means. That's just the way business is done, okay, in regular order. So at least it having to go through Richie Neal would have been necessary, which, by the way, means we need to pull or vacate the chair on Richie Neal too, not simply Nancy Pelosi, okay, in one way or another. Do I think this is a good thing? No, I don't. I think H.R. 1976 is a great bill, okay, at this point. And any markup is likely to make it worse, because the only people who would make improvements in the bill, okay, are people who are going to be sitting there in a defensive crouch trying to prevent the dangerous amendments to that bill before it goes to a vote. So no, I don't think it's a good thing. But it is a thing we could not do anything about. And yes, it was 7 committees, not 6. I originally thought it was 6, but keeping track on it, I notice it's now 7. And Rahul Majumdar says, China's Sinovac about 50% effective as of now. So, not high enough then, Rahul. It has to be at 65 to 70%, I understand. At the very least, 60%. So it's not effective enough. Kay says Cuba has 5 vax. Um, 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 I'm ready to move to Cuba. Okay? You could do worse. You could do worse. The happiness index is probably pretty high in Cuba. Oh, yeah. Rahul says Sputnik vaccine has a high rate of effectiveness. Yes, I noticed that. It does have a high rate of effectiveness. But the Russians produced a pretty good vaccine. Antonio says Cuba's backed by Switzerland and mostly everything medical science. Okay, but if they manufacture, it will be on their own. Yes, because they want to make sure that they get it. So yes, it's going to be on their own. Absolutely. They're going to insist on having that capability themselves, and they'll do a very good job. But they will share the property rights on it. I'm sure with the rest of the world, they will allow other people to produce it. They will share the IP. Kay says, Wolf is everywhere these days, laugh out loud. Lana says, go Cuba. Antonio says, if you want to go fast, you go alone. If you want to go far, but you bring your friends. Carmen says, China will probably collaborate with Cuba on medical matters, especially the vaccine. Yeah, they've been collaborating with Cuba, on interferon for some time. So yeah, they're probably going to collaborate with Cuba, on medical matters. In fact, if Cuba develops a more effective vaccine than China has, China will probably do all it can do with that particular vaccine. The Chinese aren't shy. If it works better, they're going to take it on. No doubt about it. Okay, folks, if you have any questions, further comments that you want to make, I have come to the end of the comment stream. So I'll relax for a moment, give you a chance for some final comments. So, thank you for coming. Thank you for staying.
Thank you for sharing.
Thank you for sharing, says Bonnie. And thank you, Rahul. Okay. Oh, you're welcome, Rahul, I should say. Okay. And so, good night. I will see you on Saturday. Thank you, Dolores. And thank you, Kay. And we love you too, Kay. And Kay says, I love you all. So good night. And I hope to have another great show for you on Saturday.